Beatles. We all love them. Well, that's not entirely true according to a bunch of Reddit threads, but nonetheless, I love them and I grew up listening to them all the time. Their music has arguably changed the lives of and inspired more people than I think anyone can even count, even generations later. But just like most things nowadays, they have an iceberg chart. I found this iceberg chart in the Beatles Circle Jerk Reddit and thought, hey, let me make a YouTube channel going over a bunch of different icebergs because I'm bored. And for all you guys that don't know what an iceberg is, it starts off with the most known facts about the Beatles, and as the video progresses, we will dive further down the iceberg to their dark and tragic secrets. So for all you guys here right now, please drop a like, subscribe, as this is the first ever iceberg video that I'm uploading and also my second YouTube video ever. Now to the top of the iceberg, Her Majesty. Arguably one of the nicest sounding songs in my opinion, although it's not necessarily a song per se considering how short it actually is. I'd say it's more of a little tune that was never fully completed. I remember watching an interview from Paul McCartney not too long ago saying a few weeks before John Lennon had died in the horrific way he did, he was trying to encourage John to finish writing and recording the little tune, although as we know, he never actually got around to it before his untimely death. I've come to find out that most people didn't even know this song existed in the first place, since I think it's technically the shortest song ever produced and published by the Beatles, while also being at the very end of the Abbey Road album.
Out of, I think it's about 300 songs that John and I wrote together, we never had a dry session. We'd always come in and we never went away from the session going, couldn't get it today. We always finished a song, which is pretty remarkable.
Next up on the iceberg, as you probably already know, the Beatles were heavily influenced by Indian culture. They first visited India in February of 1968 to study transcendental meditation, and the stay was originally planned for only 3 months, but come to find out they all stayed and left for varying amounts of time. I heard they also loved the women there, but who knows how true that is. According to the records, Ringo Starr and his wife only stayed for 10 days and left after March 1st. Quite frankly, I don't blame them. I don't think I'd like India myself either. Paul McCartney had to leave in late March due to some business reasons of some sort. And as for John Lennon and George Harrison, they both left abruptly on April 12th after their transcendental meditation teacher was accused of touching little girls. Or at least that's what Wikipedia said. I don't know how true that is either. The Beatles' time in India was a creative period, and they reportedly wrote over 48 songs while being there, many of which appeared on their White album released later that year. The Himalayan backdrop inspired their songwriting, and the town they stayed in became a muse for their artistic evolution. Next up on the iceberg, we have Imagine. Although this isn't really a Beatles song, and it's only a song produced by John Lennon himself. So honestly, I found it quite weird that it was on the iceberg, but nonetheless, it's on there, so it must be covered. Arguably one of the more famous solo songs from each of the Beatles members as they expanded their avenues and excelled in their own individual careers. Many love this song as it paints the impossible picture, a perfect communist world. Although nowadays, I'm not particularly a huge fan, but as a child, it was certainly one of my favorites. It was originally released in 1988 as a double album, 8 years after Lennon's death in December of 1980, but as of today, it remains on one singular CD/album and is still ultra popular in comparison to other music produced by his peers during this era.
The only reason, if I'm going to get on the front page, I might as well get on the front page with the word peace.
But you've made yourself ridiculous.
Next up on this list, my childhood all-time favorite alongside Mead Mr. Mustard, The Yellow Submarine. Some of you might not know this, but not only was The Yellow Submarine both a great album and individual song, but they also had released an animated film. As you can see on screen, there's a Yellow Submarine film, and quite honestly, this is probably why this was my favorite Beatles album and song as a kid. As I've grown up though, I've really started to realize how great the Beatles management really was. Like, they really made sure that the rock band's music was relatively family friendly and appealed to all ages, as opposed to say like The Doors. And the Yellow Submarine animated movie definitely supports this opinion of mine even more because I just loved this movie so much as I was a kid. Arguably though, this is one of the more controversial Beatles albums in terms of like actual public opinion, and in other words, you either love it or you hate it. Opinions go both ways. Fans either think it's a very surreal and fun kind of movie or just bubblegum garbage. But I do have to say, it is a great watch if you're ever on some Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, if you get what I'm trying to say, which by the way leads me on to my very next topic of the iceberg. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. It's arguably one of the more popular Beatles songs, and since republished to YouTube in 2009, it's amassed over 31 million views, which is honestly a rather impressive feat for a song released way before YouTube was ever a platform, let alone social media and just modern day technology entirely. But there isn't much mystery about this song besides the fact that if you take the first letters of each word, it spells out LSD, also known as lysergic acid dimethylamide. Many people think this song is about the Beatles' drug use, considering there have been interviews where the Beatles members have slightly hinted at their unintentional use of the psychedelic drug, as a dentist had once snuck it into their coffees in the morning.
So when did George Harrison sort of break through as an identity?
1966. Well, I mean, he was always in there. George Harrison, whoever the real one is, was always there, really. But 1966 was when I sort of woke up out of my dream.
What made you wake up?
Well, a number of things. The experiences that we were having, and one experience which I don't really like to talk about too much, but somebody put something in my coffee.
But in a separate interview, John Lennon essentially says that this was all completely a coincidence and that his son had come home from school one day with a drawing from art class that he called Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
Has it ever been settled whether Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was a code for anything?
It never was, and nobody believes me. I even saw some famous star introducing, I've forgotten who it was, introducing a Lennon McCartney show, and it was Mel Torme saying about how Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was about LSD. This is the truth. My son came home with a drawing and showed me this strange-looking woman flying around. I said, what is it? He said, it's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And I thought, that's beautiful. I immediately wrote a song about it. The song had gone out, the whole album had been published, and somebody noticed that the letters spelt out LSD.
Next up on the Big Old Berg, we have a misquote from John Lennon saying that either the Beatles or rock and roll was bigger than Jesus. And of course, back then was nothing like today. The majority of families were still very much both Christian and Catholic. As you can expect, there was a ton of backlash and people back then that absolutely hated this, and it definitely changed their opinions of Lennon.
Beatles made a statement in all the newspapers that they're getting more better than Jesus himself, and the Ku Klux Klan, being a religious order, is going to come out here the night that they appear at the Coliseum here, and we're going to demonstrate with different ways and tactics to stop this performance.
But most of the people that demonized John for saying this didn't understand was that by saying this, he meant that he didn't really know what the church was doing wrong. He felt as if they hadn't been building Jesus up enough, and that it should be the other way around.
The mouth, that the Beatles are more popular than Christ? When I was talking about it, it was very close and intimate with this person that I know who happens to be a reporter, and I was using expressions on things that I just read and derived about Christianity, only I was saying it in the simplest form that I know, which is the natural way I talk. They're more popular than Jesus and so and so and so and so. But she took them, and people that know me took them exactly as it was.
Now, as we go a bit deeper towards the second tier of the iceberg, we have the Abbey Road album cover, arguably one of the best and statistically the most successful Beatles albums entirely. Not to mention, it's one of the most recognizable album covers in all of rock and roll, mainly because all the members are wearing shoes except for Paul McCartney. Reason for this being, according to many conspiracy theorists, Paul McCartney died sometime in 1966 in a car crash, and this was a subtle hint at that fact. This is an urban legend amongst most of the Beatles fandom, and I remember I was randomly watching Beatles YouTube videos in like 2012 as a 5th grader, absolutely fascinated with this theory. According to the Beatles press officer, he thinks that this theory was initially sparked by a minor road accident McCartney was involved in several months before John Lennon had his own nearly fatal car crash in January of 1967. But the whole idea and thought process behind this unconfirmed conspiracy was that Paul's health was recorded to be deteriorating rapidly since early 1966, and then all of a sudden he died in a car crash due to driving under bad health. A bit far-fetched if you ask me, and honestly you'd be a fool to think that the Beatles didn't play on this to further add to what they probably felt was like a big joke that just got them more publicity. But according to theorists, to spare the public from mass grief, the Beatles management replaced Paul with a doppelganger, subsequently communicating this secret through subtle details of their albums. However, rumors did decline after Life had published an interview with McCartney in 1969.
I was always frightened of classical music.
and I never wanted to listen to it because it was Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and sort of big words like that, and Schoenberg.
But let's not forget that, you know, this wasn't the only clue as to why fans thought Paul was dead. There were distinct little details like Paul having a black rose and Your Mother Should Know while everyone else had a red rose, as well as on a few Beatles songs. If you actually play them in reverse, there are several songs where you can distinctly and clearly hear Paul is dead, clear as day, which I'll roll for you right now. So anyways, moving on to the next topic on the second tier of this iceberg, let's dive into the Beatles cartoon. Personally, I wasn't even aware of its existence until I started researching for this video, but the Beatles cartoon aired in 1965 to 1969 and ran for a total of 3 seasons and 39 episodes. The series kicked off with its first episode titled A Hard Day's Night, which I thought was honestly just a nice nod to the band's iconic film and album of the same name. The cartoon was a playful and colorful take on the Beatles' adventures, featuring band members in various comedic scenarios. It was aimed primarily at children and reflected the fun, whimsical side of the Beatles persona, which honestly goes back to what I said around the Yellow Submarine. The Beatles management really did a great job in making sure that this band appealed to all generations. The show was produced by King Features, and while it might not have reached the same legendary status as their music, it certainly adds an interesting layer to the Beatles' extensive legacy. Next up, it's definitely important to address some of the darker aspects of John Lennon's personal life. There are records and accounts indicating that Lennon had a troubled side in his relationships, including instances of physical abuse towards his first wife, Cynthia Lennon. While John Lennon is celebrated for his musical genius and his advocacy for peace, it's definitely crucial to acknowledge that he was also a flawed individual, like pretty much everyone watching this video. His behavior at times was, you know, nonetheless troubling. For instance, he physically slapped Cynthia during their relationships out of pretty much jealousy, and reportedly had an incident where he also had strangled another partner while intoxicated. It's definitely essential to understand, you know, that people are complex and can exhibit both admirable and reprehensible behaviors. And not to mention, John Lennon spent the rest of his life pretty much paying and trying to redeem himself for these acts of violence. You know, in the latter part of his life, you know, he demonstrated a commitment to just always getting better, so you can't really not respect that. However, it is kind of also worth noting that these aspects of his life often receive way more attention than similar issues involving other similar figures, such as like Ringo Starr, who also faced personal controversies. I'm pretty sure he like beat his wife and sent her to the hospital pretty much. So you really have to think, you know, he slapped his wife, yeah, but the amount of backlash he got is mainly because of Lennon's immense fame and honestly broader impact of his life and work, as opposed to say Ringo Starr, for example. No hate towards Ringo Starr, I'm just kind of throwing that out there. Next up, we have Hey Jude, which was actually originally written for Julian Lennon, who, for all you guys don't know, was John Lennon's first son with Cynthia. This shouldn't be confused with his second son, Sean, whom he had with Yoko Ono. Interestingly enough, Hey Jude was actually written by Paul McCartney, who actually wrote it to uplift Julian during, you know, John and Cynthia's divorce. The song was initially titled Hey Jules, but was later changed to Hey Jude because Paul thought it just sounded better. This attempt at comforting John's son is somewhat ironic given John's complex and often controversial character. Despite John's legendary status in music, many interviews reveal that, you know, Julian Lennon and his relationship with his father was relatively strange.
Think about your dad. What is the overwhelming emotion you feel, Julian?
Well, I mean, it still saddens me that you know, that we didn't have an adult life together. But I certainly, and I don't think, obviously, he wasn't the best father in the world. That's for sure, at least not in my case.
Julian has publicly spoken about the emotional and sometimes physical distance he felt from his father. There was one instance Julian had recounted that involved him asking his dad to turn down the music. Instead of complying, John Lennon just turned the volume up even higher, allegedly to the point, you know, where Julian's eardrum hurt. Personally, I wouldn't count this as abuse, but I guess, hey, you know, I'll leave it up to the viewers. Let me know in the comments, maybe. If anything, it does kind of highlight that, you know, there was kind of a strained relationship there. He wouldn't be talking bad about his father on interviews if there wasn't something bad there. Or maybe he would. I actually have no idea.
To a degree, I was abandoned as a kid, you know, twice. if not 3 times in many respects.
Next up, let's talk about the quote-unquote fifth Beatle. This term actually refers to several key figures who played a crucial role in the Beatles' rise to fame. First, we have Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager who is often considered the fifth Beatle. Epstein was absolutely instrumental in shaping their career and guiding them towards stardom. Sadly, he did end up passing away at the young age of 32, and some even argue that his death was pretty much the reason that the Beatles eventually broke up. Then you have George Martin, who's also categorized as the fifth Beatle. He was actually the producer and made significant contributions to the sound and overall just success entirely. Additionally, you have other influential figures who were also categorized as this, like the keyboardist Billy Preston. These individuals, though not played a huge part in the band itself, were definitely pivotal and, you know, really contributed to the success and lasting legacy of the band as a whole. Next up on our list, we have Pete Best, and actually, he is the fifth Beatle technically. Best was the original drummer for the Beatles before Ringo Starr, so I guess you can honestly categorize him as the fourth Beatle and Ringo as the fifth if you really want to get, you know, real literal. Pete Best's, you know, departure from the group is a little bit more controversial and one of the most debated topics in Beatles history. Pete Best joined the Beatles in 1960 and played with them during their early years in Hamburg and Liverpool. His drumming style was definitely different from Ringo Starr's, and while he had a strong local following, there were several reasons why he left or, you know, got kicked out in the first place. One theory is that, you know, George Martin was actually kind of dissatisfied with Best's drumming skills. During some of the Beatles' early kind of recording sessions at Abbey Road, Martin allegedly expressed concerns about Best's ability to kind of keep time and suggested that a session drummer replace him for the recordings. It's also kind of been reported that the 3 other Beatles, George, Paul, and John, felt that Pete Best didn't quite fit in with their tight-knit group. They reportedly saw him as an outsider and believed that Ringo Starr, who was a popular drummer from another Liverpool band, would better fit both musically and just personally as a character. Additionally, it is worth noting that Pete Best had a little bit more of a reserved personality compared to the other Beatles. This contrast definitely contributed to that decision as the band sought a more, you know, cohesive and overall just dynamic presence. On August 16th of 1962, Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, informed Pete Best that he was replaced by Ringo Starr, and obviously Pete Best wasn't too happy. This was a shock to not only himself, but also to all of the Beatles fans. You know, some view this as a necessary step for the Beatles to achieve their legendary success, while others just kind of see it as an unfortunate and harsh decision that just didn't need to happen. In the end, Pete Best's story is definitely a reminder as to why fame is just overall super unpredictable, and just the difficult decisions that sometimes need to be made.
Somebody said, sorry, Pete, or we'll talk to you later about it, or it was business, or nothing.
No, just stony silence.
Next up, we have the Plastic Ono Band. John Lennon and Yoko Ono started the Plastic Ono Band in 1969, but instead of it just being a regular band, it was more of a flexible group with different musicians joining in. They wanted to make music that was overall different from the Beatles and just show their activism. Their first big song, Give Peace a Chance, was recorded during a peace protest, and it became famous for just promoting peace overall. They had musicians like Eric Clapton and George Harrison join in sometimes, and their albums were known for being personal and experimental. The Beatles Anthology is a huge project from the 1990s that looked back at the Beatles' whole career. It includes a TV documentary, 3 albums with rare recordings, and a book. The documentary showed lots of old footage and interviews that had kind of been lost over time, and the albums had new songs like Free as a Bird made after John Lennon's death. These were pretty much just lost demos that they kind of synthesized and put together. The book gave even more details about the band's history as well. Before they were the Beatles, John Lennon started a band called the Quarrymen in 1956. It was mainly a rock and roll band, and actually Paul McCartney joined in 1957, and then later on George Harrison did too. Overall though, as time went on, they eventually changed their name to the Beatles in 1960, setting the stage for their future success. The Beatles helped shape heavy metal music. Their song Helter, Skelter from the White Album is considered one of the first ever heavy metal tracks. It was loud and intense, which actually influenced later bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, which actually leads me to my next point, Charles Manson and the White Album, which by the way, Charles Manson could be a whole other video with a whole other iceberg, but Charles Manson was essentially a cult leader, and he pretty much twisted the meaning of the Beatles' White Album and used it to justify his violent crimes. In many interviews, he goes on to say that he actually thought that the White Album and Helter Skelter were the Beatles directly talking to him, forcing him to create, you know, pretty much just mass paranoia and commit violent crimes. The Beatles were absolutely horrified by this, as anyone would be, and it shows how sometimes people can just overall misinterpret art in very, very dark ways. Paul McCartney's Temporary Secretary. In 1980, Paul McCartney released Temporary Secretary, a song with a very unusual electronic sound for its time. It was a big change from his previous work and showed his willingness to kind of experiment with new styles. Overall, it became a cult favorite, and many say that it was ahead of its time. Bob Dylan and the Beatles. In 1964, Bob Dylan introduced the Beatles to marijuana. This meeting inspired the Beatles to explore new sounds and ideas, which showed up in their later albums like Rubber Soul and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Your Face blooper. While the Beatles were making and overall creating the animated film Yellow Submarine, John Lennon made a funny mistake during his recording, saying your face instead of his lines, which I think were the door or something along those lines. I can't really remember. But overall, it made everyone laugh and pretty much just showed the band's playful style. Next up, we have Now and Then, which is a song that John Lennon made, and it was overall just left unfinished until after his death. In 2023, though, the remaining Beatles actually finished it using modern technology, and this song is a touching reminder of their enduring bond and overall just legacy as a whole. Next up, we have John Lennon's controversial song, which this is kind of a big one. John Lennon eventually wrote a song, and it was titled Women is the N-Word of the World. Obviously, I can't say it for YouTube monetization reasons, but he created this song in 1972, which used shocking language to overall just highlight women's struggles. The title was meant to essentially provoke thought about gender inequality, though it was very controversial and overall just criticized for its use of the racial slur. Next up, believe it or not, Ringo Starr actually narrated the children's show Thomas the Tank Engine in the 1980s. His friendly voice made the show very, very popular with kids and showed his talents beyond music because he did a really, really popular and playful voiceover essentially. Alan Klein's controversy. Alan Klein managed the Beatles' business affairs from 1969 to 1973. Although he was known for being tough, but was also accused of mishandling money and causing problems within the band, which contributed to their breakup. And believe it or not, George Harrison actually went on to start another band, the Traveling Wilburys. I hope I said that right. In 1988, George Harrison joined a supergroup called the Traveling Wilburys. The band also included Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, and a few other artists. They came together while working on a song for Harrison's album and decided to essentially form a group. They released 2 albums, the Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 and the Traveling Wilburys Volume 3. Their music mixed rock, folk, and country, and overall, it was just a super big hit. The group didn't really last too long though, partly because one of the members ended up passing away and the other members were just super busy with their other projects. But the music that they actually created is still celebrated to this day. Self-Portrait, a film about John Lennon's penis. Yep, you heard that right. Yoko Ono's film Self-Portrait from 1970 included some controversial scenes of John Lennon's naked body. The film is known for its experimental style and exploration of its intimate themes. And as we talk about things that affected the band, believe it or not, Ringo Starr actually left the Beatles, the whole entire crew, during the White Album sessions. During the recording of the Beatles' White Album in 1968, Ringo felt frustrated with the tensions among the band members and just picked up and left. Ringo took off to his home, but he returned a few weeks later after the others talked to him and overall everyone just kind of made up. His departure was a sign of the band's struggles during this period, but eventually they worked things out and just finished the album together, as most of you guys know. In the 1970s, a rumor spread that the mysterious band Klaatu, I hope I'm saying that right, was actually the Beatles in disguise. Fans actually thought that the band's self-titled debut album sounded like a new Beatles record because of its style and themes. The rumor began when the album was released with no photos or details about the band. This secrecy fueled speculation. The rumor eventually gained traction when a song on the album, Sub Rosa Subway, seemed to reference the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. However, this was just a Canadian band with no actual connection to the Beatles, and the mystery was just a clever marketing tactic that they eventually played on, much like the Beatles played on Paul is Dead. Not to mention, the band has actually come on record to say that, you know, the similarity in sound was just completely accidental. The Beatles and NUJV. In 1967, a mysterious album called NUJV surfaced. Fans wondered if it was just a secret Beatles project or something related to them. The album was shrouded in mystery, leading to speculation about its origins. Some thought it was a hidden Beatles release or a project by one of the members, but all in all, as it turns out, The NUJV album cover was actually the cover for Help, and it spells out NUJV. The mystery of NUJV is more about how rumors can grow around anything that seems unusual or linked to just famous names. So it wasn't really just a mysterious album from another band, it was just a misinterpretation that ended up gaining traction. John Lennon's UFO sighting. In 1974, John Lennon claimed to have seen a UFO while in New York City. He described it as a bright, saucer-shaped object hovering in the sky. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, saw it for several minutes before it just up and disappeared. Lennon's UFO sighting was intriguing because it added to his reputation for exploring unconventional ideas. Although there's no concrete evidence to support his claim and it probably didn't happen, it remains a curious part of his personal story. George Harrison and Maureen Starkey's rumored affair. In the 1970s, there were rumors that George Harrison and Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife, had a brief affair. This speculation started when reports surfaced about their close relationship during that time. Both Harrison and Starkey were a part of a close-knit circle of Beatles and their partners, which might have led to misunderstandings or gossip. While there's no solid proof of an affair, the rumors highlight the complex personal dynamics within the Beatles' inner circle. Now to the very bottom of the iceberg. I'm not going to be covering these because it's literally all jokes. Anyways, guys, thank you so much to all you guys that have made it this far in this video. Not gonna lie, after a while, I just kind of started skipping topics and kind of just rapid firing away because there was so much. And a lot of them were complete bullcrap. As you can see here, it says MMT phone number Pepperland suicide myth. But if you guys want me to do a full-on part 2 covering every single topic on this iceberg, be sure to drop a like on this video and comment the Beatles down below. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one, whenever that actually comes out.